15 reasons why Africa should boycott France. For several decades in Africa, debates have taken place around economic relations between France and its former colonies on the continent. Despite statements, French President Emmanuel Macron is in no mood to end an unequal and unfair relationship, as his country continues to control the trade and currency of these former colonies. The maintenance of economic dominance allows the prolongation of political dominance. The trade was one of the causes of colonization by France. In the Maghreb, the ports of Tunis and Algiers were essential for transit, and they already existed during the Ottoman era. French colonization created ports. The best known is that of Casablanca, Morocco. The chambers of commerce in France encouraged these constructions to increase the volume of trade, hence exploiting Africa with ease. Today we'll be looking at 15 reasons why Africa should boycott France. These reasons are policies and doings by France to Africa which should be addressed and reconstructed in order to boycott the continuous manipulation from France using the CFA franc currency. 15. 21st century colonization. Even after the end of colonialism, France has continued to expand its presence and influence in Africa. This can be observed from a variety of perspectives, one of which is the usage of the franc CFA, a currency backed by France in about 14 former French colonies. 2 African central banks have been required to deposit a significant portion of their foreign currency reserves into the French treasury for decades under the CFA franc system. Do you believe that a nation with complete independence would honor such a duty, as you'd be witnessing right now? The sums that African nations deposit in the French treasury are equivalent to twice as much in aid as France provides to sub-Saharan Africa. It will be fair to say France is using Africa and taking the African continent into a downward spiral, being dependent and always begging for help. If Africa boycotts France and is able to stop this deposit of funds to France, then there will be a positive change, not just for French-speaking African countries, but for the entire continent. 14. Using African money to build France. In essence, France helps Africans by returning a portion of the forced deposits. The French people should accept the fact that a sizable portion of the money they keep in banks comes from exploitation of former colonies on the continent of Africa, according to Jacques Chirac, a former president of France. Because France hasn't ended the relationships that greatly benefit her from the use of the franc CFA, which she continues to use to manipulate and exploit Africans, this situation still exists today. These are some of the reasons why Africa needs to boycott France. But before we continue, make sure to like, subscribe to our channel, and leave us your opinions about this topic in the comment section below. Here are the 13 remaining reasons why Africans should not support France, but rather boycott them and the CFA. 13. Like we earlier discussed in the last 2 points, since more than 75 years ago, countries in the franc CFA zone have been required to keep half of their foreign exchange reserves in an operational account owned by the French treasury. There were 14 of these countries in Africa. France still maintains a firm hold on these 14 former colonies. It is noteworthy that only 15 of 50% deposits made by Africans at the French treasury can be accessed in a single year. They don't know how much money they've saved up to this point, but no one wants to discuss it out of fear of the unknown. For more than 60 years, France has prevented the former colonies from living independently and still directly dominates and controls their economies today. 12. France's former colonies are forced to use the colonial currency, the franc CFA. The franc CFA has been the currency used in the former French colonies since 1945, and former French colonies have used this currency as their official currency. According to the majority of scholars, the franc CFA currency was created and imposed on African countries in order to maintain Franco-African ties forever. The European Union has repeatedly denounced this, but France is unwilling to abolish a system that deprives African nations of their wealth and sends roughly $500 billion from each of the colonial African countries each year to French coffers. A few people are aware of the precise amounts that Africa has invested in the French coffers, But despite France's careful concealment of this information, some officials continue to express doubt about the nation's accountability. In 2008, former French President Jacques Chirac declared, "Without Africa, France will fall into the ranks of third world powers." Number 11. France has the right to automatically seize the African nation's national reserves, as was previously mentioned. France has held the national reserves of 14 African nations since their independence in the 60s: Benin, Burkina Faso, Ivory Coast, Mali, Niger, Senegal, Togo, Equatorial Guinea, Chad, Congo-Brazzaville, and Gabon are among these nations. The French government controls so-called operations accounts where more than 80% of the foreign reserves of these African nations are kept. Do you really believe that Africans should continue to experience such unjust rule? Well, let us know in the comment section below. 10. France still views Africa from a colonial perspective, and the majority of the changes she has enacted there have benefited her greatly while harming Africans. France still adheres to the colonial empire's principle that all African nations must do their part to advance France's development. Currently, France has trained and supported hundreds or even thousands of traders in Africa who are called upon to carry out another military coup or instigate dangerous political unrest within the continent, as seen in Burkina Faso and other African nations. 9. It is forbidden for the African nations to join any military coalitions. All African nations have military alliances with their former colonial powers in general, but as you can see, France does not allow its armed forces to approach those of other powerful countries like Britain and the US. Those who disobey this rule are pursued and subdued, while supporters are showered with gifts. This implies that some of these alleged African leaders are merely puppets of France. Even the French Union has at times criticized this French policy. Africans are in a better position to choose exactly what they want if they do not want to continue wearing blindfolds, because France forbids them from seeking any form of military cooperation and protection out of that provided by them. 8. Africans are under pressure to speak French rather than their native tongues. Have you noticed that their former colonies in Africa strongly enforce the French language requirement, while other languages receive little to no attention? This language is used for almost all official purposes. Even in public exams, the French language is most commonly used in Cameroon, despite the fact that English is also recognized as an official language in that nation. The fact that French is the majority official language in Cameroon explains in part why the English-speaking regions of the country have separation demands. All important communiques in Cameroon are in French, meanwhile English is also an official language. Number 7. Africa must boycott France and the monetary manipulation with the franc CFA, because France asserts the right to exploit any natural resource discovered in the nation. France asserts the right to acquire any natural resources discovered on the soil of its former colonies. These African nations are not permitted to freely seek out other partners. This makes them completely dependent on France, hence acting as a major restraint to the growth of not just their colonies, but Africa as a whole. 6. In the context of public procurement and bidding, France compels African nations to give preference to French interests and businesses. France decided to give her colonies free rein because she was powerless to stop the call for African independence. To prevent their relations from being hampered, these nations signed agreements with France. Every investment that France makes on the continent of Africa typically comes with conditions. France actually wants the money spent during the colonial era on her former colonies in Africa to be reimbursed. In all African government procurement bids, French banks grant loans to Africans with exaggerated interest rates of 5 to 6% or even more. 5. Only France will be used to train senior military officers in these African nations. In order to avoid being assassinated by the French, none of the leaders of the assimilated nations in former African colonies have spoken out against France's continued decision-making on crucial matters pertaining to the creation of their militaries. Because France still chooses to train and run the military forces of the former colonized African nations, this has led to a lack of autonomy within these nations' armed forces. As a result, the highly skilled officers return to continue assimilation policy after completing their training in France. France continues to view itself as a stabilizing force in Africa, so its previous adopted policies are still in place. This has resulted in a series of increasingly frequent military interventions. African nations seek the support of a strong nation during difficult times, but France typically provides that support while expecting something even greater in return. 4. Military from Africa must join France's senior military officers, instructed to let their troops form alliances with France if there were any further threats while they were receiving training in France. They still have to follow France's instructions, despite the challenging policies that are slowly killing off African nations. When former French colonies are contrasted to other nations in Africa, the non-French colonies have seen significant development since they were freed from colonial rule. However, the majority of them unfortunately flee to Britain and America or other nations at the first chance they get, with no intention of ever coming back. In the meantime, there are many young talents and minds that can help the continent develop with little to no outside assistance. How would you address this situation to the general population if you were a world leader? The United Nations, other nations, and organizations are shamelessly silent despite being aware of what is happening. For fear of their lives, many African leaders keep to themselves and are reluctant to speak out. The majority of assassinated African leaders, from the time of African independence to present, have some connection to France. 3. The French rule must be avoided by all costs, giving back power to the African people. How did the French control their colonies? Colonies were ruled, on the one hand, through decrees issued by two different ministries, the Ministry of Interior and the Colonial Office in Paris, and on the other hand, by executive orders that made the representative of the French government the main source of law. Number 2. Does France help Africa? The answer is no. Taking into consideration the number of resources being exploited from Africa by France, and the aid France gives back to Africa, not even one bit of comparison there. It is fair to say France is only destroying Africa instead of helping. Number 1. When Guinea demanded independence from French colonial rule in 1958, the French unleashed their fury, with more than 3,000 people leaving the country, taking their entire property. In addition, they destroyed anything that couldn't be taken, destroying schools, nurseries, public administration buildings, cars, books, medicine, research institutes, instruments. Tractors were crushed and sabotaged, animals were killed, and food in warehouses were burned or poisoned. In effect, they were sending a message to all other colonies that the consequences of rejecting France would be high. This is enough reason to boycott France today. What are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comment section below. And if you have any other reasons that Africa should boycott France, we'll be waiting to see those in the comment section. Thanks for watching. Please make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell, as we'll see you in our next video.